Hey everyone, this is Mike from the Comic Book Trove, back today with another book review, and today I'm going to be continuing my October Halloween theme of spotlighting certain horror-centric books in my collection. So today I'm going to be taking a look at the Marvel Horror Omnibus, which really says it in the name, doesn't it? So this is the Marvel Horror Omnibus from a couple of years ago now. I think it came out back in 2019. And this is a really interesting book. It's a collection of different stories. Well, it focuses on different characters, different kind of monster slash horror themed characters from the 1970s that were published by Marvel, of course. And in here it collects kind of the complete 1970s runs on these characters. So you get the cover here, pretty cool image featuring the living mummy. The spine is this kind of, it looks like a white spine. It's actually a very, very light grey. So when you put it next to some of the white spined omnibus, you can tell it's actually very slightly darker. But for all intents and purposes, it is white. But it's a cool spine with Marvel's very obscure Scarecrow character coming at you there. And then on the back, really cool design on the back of the book here. I think this looks really good. Marvel puts the super into supernatural, and it says here, featuring the complete 1970s adventures of these characters. So it's the zombie, the living mummy, Brother Voodoo, It, the living colossus, the golem, or golem, and Gabriel, the devil hunter, the scarecrow, and Modred, the mystic. Now, I would imagine, in most cases, those are pretty obscure characters that most people will not be too familiar with. I think you'd have to be kind of a hardcore 1970s horror comic fan to already be fully familiar with all of those characters and all the stories in here, which I will admit that I am not, and I wasn't before I read this book. So pretty much all of this, I think in fact like 95% of this was new to me when I read the book, and it was really cool to kind of experience it that way. So on the book itself, on the front, you get this awesome image of the zombie, which we'll take a look at in just a moment in terms of the actual book itself. The spine is the same, and on the back, another cool image featuring Gabriel, the devil hunter, demon hunter. Cool stuff. So, take a look inside, and I'll just do my usual thing here. I'm just going to do a kind of flick through the book, show it off, give some of my thoughts along the way. So yeah, when you open up the book, firstly, it breaks it down into different characters, and that's the way this book is broken up. So it's in chunks, focusing on each of the characters. So as you read through the book, you read everything about the zombie, and then you move on to Brother Voodoo, then Living Mummy, and so on. This first page shows you the different creators, the writers, artists, inkers, etc., who worked on each one. And you can see here there's a huge list of names. You're getting a whole different array of talent working on different parts of the content in this book. All kinds of names, some familiar to me and probably to you, and others not so familiar, to me at least. But yeah. Then the next page, the contents itself. So this is where it breaks down exactly what's collected. So it is still broken down by character, but it tells you exactly what the issues are that are collected with each character, because in most cases it's not as simple as these characters having their own series. Most of them were appearing as side characters, guest characters in other stories, or popping up in different kind of anthology series. Yeah, so as you can see, it's all broken down there quite nicely. Some characters have a lot more content than others, so there's quite a lot of stuff for the zombie, barely anything for the scarecrow. So yeah, it's not all totally equal in terms of the amount of content for each character, but it is a complete set of content for each character. And then yeah, so you go straight in. Now some of this, a lot of the book is in black and white, and that's because a lot of the different series in here are from magazine content. So the zombie, for example, was published as magazine rather than a comic book, so it was in black and white. And I'll just say as well, at this point, well, I should probably point out, technically, there is a mature content warning on this book, because it is horror themed, and because it's magazine content. In magazines, typically, there's a bit more mature stuff than in comic books, so you get a little bit more violence, things can be a little bit more graphic, a bit more, I don't know, nudity, stuff like that sometimes. So yeah, I'm going to flick through this book, and I just felt like I should give that warning, since the book itself gives that warning, in case, I don't know, maybe you don't want to see something. But Yeah, I think, to be honest, in my opinion, by any kind of modern standards of horror, everything in here is extremely tame. But I suppose that's subjective. But the zombie then, this is, for me, this is the best thing in the book. This is the best story, the best, most interesting character. I think the artwork in here is excellent. Initially, it's by John Buscema in this issue, but then the majority of it is by a guy called Pablo Marcos. And it's just, yeah, it's a very strikingly good looking book. It's a very interesting story. There are these odd patches of green in here. I said it was a black and white comic, and it is, but in this first issue, for some reason, you get these occasional green bits, but that doesn't continue through the rest of it. The zombie was originally created back in the 1950s in I think a one-off story by Stan Lee and Bill Everett, if I remember rightly. So what this series was kind of taking that short story, that little almost nothing story, and reworking it into something more substantial. So what the gist of it is, it focuses on a businessman, a rich guy called Simon Garth, and through unfortunate circumstances, I won't spoil any of the details too much, he ultimately ends up being killed and kind of cursed to come back to life as this zombie. There he is, and this is where the Pablo Marcos art starts, who I think, I'm not really familiar with his work on anything other than this series, to be honest, but if this book is anything to go by, I can safely say he is a great artist. So yeah, you're kind of just following the zombie around, Simon Garth around. He kind of just vaguely remembers who he is, but for the most part, he's now, well, a zombie, he's a husk. And there's this medallion, this kind of cursed medallion thing that anybody who manages to get a hold of it, whilst they are holding it physically in their possession, they can use it to control him. So anything that they command him to do whilst they hold it, he has to do. But the second that they let go of it, he's free, to do his own thing again, which is mostly slowly walking around. So he's not an undead zombie as such. He's not a zombie that wants to eat people. He's not that kind of thing. He's not maybe a classic style zombie, but it's more of a voodoo zombie. And voodoo plays a pretty strong role in this story in terms of voodoo magic, that sort of stuff. And it's all very interesting. So I don't know whether that little summary I gave really did it much justice, but yeah, I had a lot of fun reading this. There's a lot more to it than I thought there was going to be. As I say, as a zombie character, you would think if you're writing a zombie, there's not a lot you could really do with that concept if you're going to have a zombie as a protagonist. They managed to do it quite well, I think, overall, and it's not a super long series. I think it's 9 or 10 issues. But I think it is the longest kind of story arc in here. It's the biggest chunk of collected material of any of the characters. Some of these covers as well, I point out, I think they're really beautifully drawn. But really, honestly, a lot of great artwork. And I think the fact it's in the black and white as well really helps it with this kind of series, because for me anyway, it really makes me think of sort of classic horror films, the sort of black and white, old school Hollywood horror films, like Frankenstein, Dracula, The Wolfman. It has that kind of feel to it. And I know that it's black and white only because it was in a magazine, not specifically as like a creative choice. But even so, I think it works very well. Hopefully the artwork's coming across pretty well in the video, and you get a good idea of what it's like. You get a lot of these awesome kind of splash pages, great images, really good artwork, honestly. So I really enjoyed everything about this series. I think it was a cool story. It kind of had me hooked. I wanted to know what happened next. And then the artwork as well, the fact that it's, for me, really kind of striking. It's very, very good style. Yeah, it just had me enjoying it. I kind of binge read this very quickly when I first read it. And I'll say as well, it gets a proper kind of ending as well. So at the end, it doesn't just kind of, sort of fade out without coming to a proper conclusion. There is a real ending, and by the time you finish it, it does feel like you've actually concluded a story, which always helps, when it comes to any kind of story. You want to have a satisfying ending. Oh yeah, and then little bonus inclusions throughout as well, which really help this book. You get, like, for example, the original zombie. So I mentioned it was an old 1950s story, like an Atlas era comic, and this is it. So in that very first issue of Zombie collected way back, you can see how they've specifically reused but modified some of these original panels. But yeah, so this was Bill Everett artwork. Originally just a short one and done story, just a few pages. But yeah, really cool to include that at the end there, at the end of the zombie section. And the way that bonus material works in this book, it's not all at the back like it would typically be in an omnibus. You get character specific extra content at the back of each each character's section. So when you finish the zombie stuff, you get the zombie bonus content. At the end of the mummy section, you get the mummy bonus content. So on. Really cool. I always really liked that. It's a great image. So you move on to Brother Voodoo. At this point, so these are in colour because these are just comics. As I say, there's a mixture of magazine and comic content in here. But yeah, so you're getting the original early adventures of Brother Voodoo, who has gone on to be probably more of a well-known character than probably everything else, every other character in here. But even so, I'd say overall he's still pretty obscure compared to much more well-known popular characters anyway. But yeah, so it's interesting. But I will say, this Brother Voodoo stuff, I think I struggled to get through it the most. I don't know why, it just didn't particularly hook me. Not like the zombie story did, not like some of the others did. It's not that it's bad, it's just, I thought it was very average, this particular stuff. But that's kind of what it's like when you read a book like this, sort of a compilation book, there's going to be stuff that you like more than others. I think that, it's not likely that you're going to enjoy everything in a book like this equally. You might read this and think Brother Voodoo's the best thing in here, for example. And, fair enough if you do. Some cool artwork, though. I'm a fan of the kind of Bronze Age artwork anyway. There was some Brother Voodoo appearances in issues of Zombie as well. So this isn't a return to Zombie all of a sudden. It's just Brother Voodoo appearing in one of the Zombie magazines. So again, you go back to black and white, because that was the magazine style. But I will say here, the artwork not as good as that Pablo Marcos stuff in the main Zombie stories. Then you get Marvel Team Up issue. It's kind of funny when you read something like The Zombie in here, which is definitely a horror story. Like it feels like proper horror when you read that, with some quite mature themes and things going on. But then you can also get to just an issue of Marvel Team Up, and suddenly you've got Spider-Man involved, making his little jokes and quips. It's a very interesting tonal shift. And then after this, you can go back to something more horror themed again, like another magazine story. As a general rule, the stories in the black and white magazines are more kind of mature than the comic stuff, I would say. Not that that makes them better, but it's just a difference that's worth pointing out. Quite a lot of Brother Voodoo in here, though. Yeah, team up with the Thing. Yes, there's probably just as much Brother Voodoo, if not more, than there was of the zombie. Actually, having flipped through this now. Moon Knight there making an appearance. Yeah, so then you get the back end of the Brother Voodoo stuff, so you get the bonus content featuring him. And you move on to the Living Mummy. Now, I did enjoy this more, so this was another good one. Another kind of classic horror monster, the mummy. This is not really a typical kind of version of a mummy though, so it's not like an Egyptian pharaoh buried who comes back to life, something like that. It's the story of an ancient African chief, like a tribal chief guy. I think he's called Unkantu. Might be mispronouncing that. Apologies if so. But basically, yeah, it's kind of a grim and dark story. He was kind of captured by him and his tribe, captured by the ancient Egyptians, forced into slavery. They tried to rebel. He was punished, and he had I think all of his blood was kind of sucked out and replaced with some vague artificial liquid, which kind of forces him to be, like physically paralyzed. Finds movement very difficult, so he's kind of lumbering about as a mummy, and it makes him immortal. So he's kind of just lost his mind, basically, because he's been alive in this kind of horrible state, painful state for thousands of years. So he's not doing too good, but he is kind of a hero, So he's not a monster in the sense of terrorizing people. He still has some consciousness as well. He remembers who he is, if I remember rightly, and he gets involved in, some goings on. Basically, he's got a proper story, and yeah, it was a good one. I quite liked this one. A lot of great artwork through here, though, I'll tell you that. At least if you like the kind of 70s Bronze Age style. This was the resurgence of horror comics in the 70s, because all throughout the late 50s and the 60s, horror was basically off the table completely. The Comics Code Authority just wouldn't allow it. Any kind of slight mention of anything that might be too horror focused, monster focused, it was just censored. You couldn't have vampires, you couldn't have anything that was too somehow subversive. So yeah, for a decade or more, it was just completely not allowed. And then by the 1970s, finally, Comics Code rules were starting to ease off, and you had publishers, Marvel in this case, starting to experiment with new horror comics, and finally able to do so, which can only be a good thing for me. I think all the censorship of the Silver Age was ridiculous at times. Don't get me wrong, it kind of allowed the Silver Age to be the kind of weird and wacky thing that it is, but I don't know, I think generally speaking, comics have been better since the Comics Code censorship eased off and gradually disappeared completely. But this was a big step in that process, with the 70s and the resurgence of horror comics and the popularity of horror in comics. So it's it's like reading through a book like this and its companion, the Horror Lives Again book. It's very much like having an important milestone in comic history collected in here. Throughout as well, there are the occasional stories like this one, which collect older stories from late 50s, early 60s, some of the Stan Lee, Jack Kirby monster stories, like here. So it's the majority of the things collected in here are from the 70s, and then just now and again they throw in one of these earlier stories, which are much different. But I think they've thrown those in because that was the origin of this the living Colossus creature. And then they jump forward and you get the 70s versions. This was one of the weaker ones though. You know, this didn't quite grab my interest in the same sense as the zombie stuff, the living mummy stuff. I think those two were really the highlights for me, zombie and the mummy. Other stuff is cool, but not quite as strong. But there is this very cool double-page spread of It, the living Colossus fighting Fin Fang Foom. The big green dragon. And then, you know, like I mentioned as well, you just go into random comics sometimes in which these characters guest appeared. So you're jumping into an issue of Hulk here. Oh yeah, here's the original Fin Fang Foom story. So this is another one of the Jack Kirby stories. This stuff is the sort of thing that filled up those monster buses, those Jack Kirby monster buses that came out a few years ago. And then you move on to the Golem. Actually, I'll tell you which other one I enjoyed, and that's coming up soon, was Gabriel, the Devil Hunter. That was pretty dark. Quite enjoyed that one. But this is a big book, you know, it's page count pretty massive. You know, as you can see, we're over 1,000 pages now, and there's still quite a bit to go. But this, I think, is where we start with Gabriel. Yep, in the Haunt of Horror. Now this is really good. Okay, this is a good one. So this is Gabriel is basically an exorcist. So he is pretty much fighting against demons, exorcising demons, going to where he's needed to do his supernatural work. And it's pretty dark. There's some pretty genuinely kind of disturbing stuff in here. We're talking about like demons, demon possession, and because it's in these magazines, it gets to be more mature than it would if it was a comic book. So yeah, this one, along with the zombie, I think have the most kind of horror feel about them. You know, like they feel like genuine, slightly disturbing, dark horror stories. Which is not to say the other stuff is bad, but this is more the sort of thing that I sort of expect from horror, personally. Little glimpse of Satana there. She makes much more of an appearance in the Horror Lives Again book. And again, I'll take a look at that one as well soon, just to show that one off. But it's really a lot more of what you get in here. Cool artwork though. I think the black and white, as I said before, it looks good. Suits the horror style. I know that some people, I think, just prefer black and white artwork generally. I prefer coloured artwork overall, but it is hard to deny that the black and white really just show off the pencil work really well and stuff like this. Okay, so then you get these issues of, so you get those magazines and then these issues of Fantastic Four, which guest appeared? Gabriel, the Devil Hunter. I think it was a story featuring Franklin Richards. He was kind of possessed. Yeah, here he is, possessed child. So in comes Gabriel to do his exorcist thing. I think Agatha Harkness. Yeah, she's involved as well. It's very much just the FF involved in a supernatural story. You get your extras with Gabriel and the Scarecrow. The shortest chunk of the book, only 3 issues. Very obscure character. Like, this was one of those where you really get the feeling that they had no idea what to do with this character. They just couldn't figure it out, and he ended up being dropped like a stone and pretty much forgotten. I don't think he's ever appeared again, this version of the Scarecrow in Marvel, since these 3 issues. And it's basically a scarecrow that it lives in a painting, and it kind of comes out of this painting and comes to life. That's a cool cover, though. That's a really cool cover. It's not that it's even that bad. It's an interesting concept. It's an interesting character. I just don't think anyone quite knew how to utilize it. I guess it just didn't really fit into anybody's plans too much, so... yeah, it's very short-lived, but it's interesting to read it. It was a decent thing. Yeah, so then I think we're into the last bit now. Mildred the Mystic. Right, yeah, so this guy, don't really remember this one this too much. He was like an ancient sorcerer type character. But I think he ends up coming into some John Byrne issues of the Avengers, like right after this. Yeah, I think it's 2 or 3 issues here when John Byrne was drawing the Avengers. So in a way, this is a highlight for me as a John Byrne fan. Certainly great artwork to flick through. Classic era of Avengers as well. But yeah, basically it's a Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver heavy story. You know, it focuses primarily on them. And Mildred, in the issues prior to this, he was more like of a heroic character. In these issues, he becomes more of a villain, and it's kind of out of nowhere, really. Like when you read it like this with those previous issues, and then you carry on into this Avengers arc, his sudden turn into being villainous is quite jarring. Not that it matters too much, because at the end of the day, none of these characters are super important, really. They're just kind of fun sort of horror reads. That's the idea, I think. Get serious Dark Phoenix flashbacks with this particular splash page there. Very cool. And that cover. But yeah, nearly done. Over 1,300 pages at this point. It's a very big book, and this is just flicking through it. So yeah, it takes a long time to read it properly if you're going to read everything. Cool extras there. But yeah, so that is that, guys. Hopefully that's given some good insight on what the Marvel Horror Omnibus is all about. It's basically like an anthology book, really, compilation book. Lots of different horror themed stuff going on. And then you've got Horror Lives Again, which I'll take a look at probably next on the channel, which is very much a continuation of this style of book. It's not a volume 2 because they don't directly continue, but they are, of course, like companions to each other. But yeah, anyway, that'll do for now, guys, I think. And yeah, hope it's been enjoyable, insightful, useful. As always, that's what I'm going for. And thank you very much for watching. I'll be back again soon.